I'm eager to know from Nelson's point of view what the what would be fitting, uh, what would be a, a positive exemplar of process here, uh, something that would actually work. What would it look like?
I'm clicking. Let me fetch a book from just behind me.
Okay. This is as we all are, right? Surrounded by stacks of books.
Yeah, well, I'm at home, and so this was on my kitchen table. And I'm just holding up this book. The author is Michael Gordon, Gordin, and it's called Scientific Babble. And it's the story of how the languages of scientific publishing have changed over the last 2,000 years, from Greek and Latin, and then into several European languages, and finally into English. And I'm roughly, I think, about halfway through the book, and so far it's been a fascinating story. But in the chapters I was reading earlier today, he points out the problem that Germany faced under Adolf Hitler, where there was a sudden exodus of 20 to 25% of scientists and mathematicians from Germany. And there was a counter reaction in the opposing countries of not wanting to use German at all. He points out that in 1910, 98% of the high schools in California had courses in German. And yet after World War I, it became illegal in several US states under newly passed laws to even speak German on the street, to communicate in German over the telephone, or to write in German. These laws were later overturned as unconstitutional. But it does show that there can be a backlash, and with the destruction of a segment of society, as the Nazis attempted to do, you can lose a tremendous amount. And for example, in my bibliographic work on Leopold Infeld, a Polish physicist who worked closely with Albert Einstein in the 1930s, much of what he wrote in Poland in newspapers in the 20s and 30s is unrecoverable because those archives of newspapers were destroyed in bombing. And there was no electronic storage equivalent. So he was a prolific writer in newspapers, as was Albert Einstein. And in both cases, most of what they wrote is gone forever. I'm not sure what the solution is. I think it ultimately has to be that we have to decide as a society that knowledge is important, that journals are important, and that we have to pay for them through public funds. Now, what would this cost? It would be a totally insignificant amount of money in any country's budget compared to what they spend on defense, healthcare, social programs, highway construction, and so on. It's not a big ticket item as governments go. We could easily do it, but it takes leadership at the top. And certainly in America, one often feels that our politicians at the local and state levels, and sometimes the national level, really have no understanding of science and education. So I think it's very hard to push something like this through. It might happen. The European Union has certainly been making some efforts about grant funding and archiving of information, but it really has to be a worldwide effort.
Yeah, and I think in Europe it's sort of decided at the wrong level. It's sort of, someone said the road to hell is paved by good intentions, and there are good intentions behind it, but what's happened is, as a result of this, many new open access journals have sprung up and are charging, what are just outlandish fees, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 to publish an article of, 7 pages or something. And there are people who run online journals with no charges to anyone, and they cover the small costs they have by donations. And the actual costs are certainly not that high. And what's happened is they just jumped on the bandwagon and saw an opportunity to get essentially government funding for doing this, but they're setting the prices, which the people actually writing the papers realize are just unrealistic. And the people, you know, who decide where the funding goes, they don't really have a feel for how much effort goes into a journal. They don't realize that the main work, refereeing, is usually done for free, and so on. And so I think that's taking, you know, a bad turn, really. And some people have said, well, you know, we'll just use the archive for distribution, the archive with X, and have an archive. You know, the journal is essentially a list of links to a linked list in a different term, a list of links to archive articles. But you know, they run into the problem that archive has very strange and intransparent policies of who's allowed to submit, and the appeals process doesn't work, and so on. That's not a workable solution either. So it's a bit strange. There's a whole company which is essentially run out of China, but it has sort of a token office in Switzerland, which has a huge number of scientific journals, and the quality is not very high, but they go through the motions of peer review, and they meet all of these open access mandates, and a lot of people publish there because of that. And they put in just enough effort that for most people, it's not worth the trouble to point out what they're doing wrong. But, you know, anyone in the field who reads the papers can see, well, this paper, you know, it hasn't been refereed by an expert. It's not really worth anything. But they are growing quite rapidly at the moment, yeah.
What's the name of that company? I'm sorry, Jonathan.
I'll put it in the chat. Let me look.
The world's largest publisher of information today is probably Facebook. And I think the present policy of Facebook is that they don't take your page down when you die. So they take care of the archiving, and one could more or less rely on them to continue to take care of that archiving as long as it was bringing in advertising revenue. As you know, the commercial model works as long as it brings in revenue. I think the biggest problem for preservation of knowledge and culture is social, economic, and other disruptions such as climate change and the present pandemic. And whilst the countries we're in are fairly safe and secure in all of this, one can see potential for enormous loss of tradition in other countries. Nelson was saying, well, it might be expensive, but it's worth it. I think there are forces that actually would like to, in so many words, rewrite history or destroy history. In other words, the forces that control what's taught in a way that is oppressive to views that are wrong in their view. There's a whole bunch of stuff like that that are social things. Maslow's law of the instrument says if the only tool you've got is a hammer, everything you see is a nail and needs to be hit. And if the only tool we've got is technology, we see every problem as having a technology solution, and so forth. I think the question of preservation of records is something that affects everybody now, because so much of their life and social interaction is done through organizations such as platforms such as Facebook, and their valuable photographs are on their iPhones and in the cloud and everything else like that. So I think there's probably a wide popular interest in the preservation of data, and it probably overwhelms this. The scientific data could probably be, well, much of the scientific data is probably a sort of small side effect of that, particularly in subjects like mathematics, where you don't have lots and lots of data and pure mathematics. Anyway, so the thing is that it's a large issue where for people coming from more or less the same background, and we're likely to come to more or less similar approaches. But there are thousands and thousands of other areas where it's all about, I think, preservation of culture. That's, if you like, the important thing. Preservation of culture and the transmission of culture. And the biggest threat, I think, is social disruption. And the second threat is nihilism, the sort of the people who disagree with us are wrong. The people who disagree with us are traitors. We have to purify the country, all this sort of stuff. Those, I think, are the biggest problems. And the fact that, what's the word? It's interesting, the printing press, when it came out, was considered to be a great benefactor and also a great threat. You know, it allowed the preservation and communication of religious texts. It allowed the production of scurrilous scandal sheets. It allowed Martin Luther's theses to be printed in thousands of copies and distributed. So all sorts of things were happening with regard to the printing press. And to say the printing press was good or bad is not the right question. I think that the values are the important, one of the really important things, are social values. And something that struck me during Patrick's talk was the way in which he was a working scientist and other working scientists knew of his involvement. And when Patrick said, and then somebody said, nature has this reference scheme and wouldn't it be nice if your stuff could adopt to it? That's exactly how that sort of community works. So I think there's a real difference between software that's developed inside a community and software that's developed outside a community. And tech started as software that was developed inside a community, really. Patrick's work was done inside a community. And looking at LaTeX, I don't see LaTeX, for example, being developed inside a community in that same sort of way. It's more, well, it is and it isn't, but I don't think it's as strong as it used to be, let's put it that way. And the focus of attention has gone much more to electronic publishing and electronic distribution. So that's, I think, where most scientists, well, many scientists, particularly, for example, data scientists, are interested in, is electronic publishing of their work, because it doesn't make sense to publish it on paper without having some means of reproducibility. And the reproducibility of science now requires much more computing capability, if you like. So I haven't been particularly coherent here, but I hope that it's been a useful contribution to the mix.
I think that's, you know, what you say is correct. We're in the lucky situation that it's really not a technical problem anymore. I mean, what does a hard disk cost these days? You know, it's 5 cents per gigabyte or something. So, you know, technically one could preserve it. It's a sociological question. You know, how it has to be managed, and a political and an economic question. It's not a technical problem anymore. You know, it could be done technically. That's not, you know, not that long ago, people would think, you know, it would be absurd to even attempt it. But it's not really a technical problem anymore. It's a sociological problem. But you mentioned Facebook as a publisher of information. But there's the opposite trend as well. There are some people whose greatest concern is how to delete all of their personal information when they die. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And, you know, make a will, which, you know, I mean, I've got a list of, I don't know, probably 100, 150 username, password, PIN, whatever, to access various websites and so on. And obviously stuff that's published is intended to be public, but people have a lot of information which they don't want to be preserved at all. And, you know, one size fits all, you know, just never delete anything won't work. And you might end up saving a lot of information which is sort of encrypted and can't be accessed anymore, you know, which is really not worth the trouble. But and some countries have passed laws, you know, saying you have a right to demand that this personal information is deleted under certain circumstances.
I think we're getting into topics that are not of special interest to the tech user group. They are of interest, but they're not of special interest to us. And I'm looking at the clock, and it's we've been going for an extra hour. Thank you, well done.
But we do have to hear what it has to say.
Yes, closing remarks, and then perhaps I'll get to the rest of my opera.
My thoughts have been going on a somewhat different track, and it has to do with, I think, concerns that align with Nelson's. I told you last week that you know, descriptive markup and SGML and the notion of semantic content was really significant, and I believe that what Nelson's talking about in relation to bibliographies has to do with a similar sort of concern. Yeah, okay, I see a nod there. So I think of this aspect as having to do with a sort of richness. And if you take a page description language, it can be reduced to a representation in print or on the screen, but the reader has to sort of infuse it with semantics by doing a process of interpretation. And the author might have wanted that semantic content to be present earlier on, and that's why we in the SGML world, or now XML world, want something that makes the characters in our documents become enriched in some way, so that they have that additional content. And I see bibliographic entries being of that sort. And for me, it extends beyond the bibliography to the entire document, because I really think that procedural markup really interferes with the value of the document, and descriptive markup adds to the value, and it has to do with semantics. And I think this is the sort of concern that has been with us since early days with tech. And, you know, one of the things that Donald Knuth did is he made this typesetting language and implemented it that allowed both descriptive and procedural markup. And I heard one fella who's much older than I am, so I have to give him due respect, but he said real men don't code with LaTeX, they use tech. So it's like I got a chance to look at one of his acolytes and watch how he was programming, and essentially re-educate him on the benefits of descriptive markup. So this is, I think, something that points to a difference between Leslie Lamport's approach, in that he was an adamant and very consistent advocate of descriptive markup. And he predates SGML. Well, I mean, arguably predates SGML. But that's what he wanted. He wanted descriptive markup. And so I think I've gone far enough. Perhaps Lamport's invention was not done within a community. I think it actually was. I think there were a bunch of people nearby Leslie who were kind of giving him encouragement. And now there's a huge LaTeX community. So, you know, that's my perspective on LaTeX. Notwithstanding its many flaws.
Any more for any more?
Just
Arthur,
thanks.
you had the last word.